Hello, and welcome back to W3B Talks. This is part 2 of a special 2-part episode on understanding blockchain in supply chains. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman, Chief Catalyst at BRI. In our last episode, we asked the question of why blockchain hasn't been as impactful in supply chain as we had forecasted. In this episode, we will ask what might change the trajectory of the technology's impact. As before, we have two of the smartest people I know on the topic. Irving Wladawsky-Berger is the legendary IBM executive that headed up IBM's Internet Division in the 1990s. He's also a research affiliate at MIT Sloan School of Business and a member of the Linux Foundation Research Advisory Board. He's also a frequent collaborator with the Blockchain Research Institute. Dale Christie is the chair of the BITA Standards Council, a global blockchain business council entity, and he's also a business fellow and blockchain strategist at FedEx. They're both past guests on W3B Talks and authors of BRI Research. In this episode, we are going to move on from what didn't work to what might work. And we're going to answer the question, what could accelerate blockchain's adoption in supply chains? Welcome back to the podcast, Irving and Dale.
Thank you. It was nice to be in part 1, so we look forward to part 2.
Happy to be part of it. I enjoyed the first part. I agree with Irving, and I look forward to this one.
Wonderful. So we asked in the first part of this discussion, the question of why didn't it live up to its expectations, its potential that we had hoped for. And we really talked about two major issues, one being the technology, its maturity, its complexity, the private versus public, its ability to support scaling, throughput, security, transactional privacy, and those sorts of things. And I think it was you, Irving, that said, actually, those are the easier problems to solve. And the harder problems being this alignment of interest problem, the getting a whole bunch of people that don't report to anyone to cooperate, to work together in the pursuit of some common goal, and to make sure that the benefits of some system are equitably distributed in such a way that people remain engaged and contributing and doing the extra work required to participate in what is frankly a more complex system. As I look at technology, I've always had this idea that we hit thresholds of value creation after which adoption is accelerated considerably. This happened with steam engines, with the automobile, electricity, the internet with mobile phones, and there's usually a combination of factors. One is that there's an intersection of enabling technologies. That's kind of one thing, and that's kind of technological capability. The second thing is that the price of those enabling technologies has fallen below a level of resistance. And the third part is that enough of a critical mass of people have decided that the time is right, that we can adopt this because we can fundamentally change the way that we've done things in the past. And so the question for me is, how close are we to that point, and what are those converging technologies or social behaviors that will allow us to get to a point where we can really start to dramatically improve the efficiency and effectiveness of global supply chains? So Dale, let's start with you. So do you see any catalysts for this change?
Well, I think that the technology continues to mature, but I'm going to mention a couple of regulatory examples that I think actually come into play here. There's multiple ways to accomplish something, right? You can choose to do it, or you can be forced to do it, or pick any other examples you want. Again, neither of these regulations are actually blockchain specific, but I think it's important to say that if we simply say, if I put a pin in the word blockchain and say, let's go do that, and let's do that in a global supply chain, that's like saying when you're 9 years old, I want to get my doctorate. There's a number of steps that have to go to get you to a certain place before you walk across that stage. And we're all simply jumping to let's go do blockchain. And so one of the things I think it's important to understand is that we have to get to digital And once we get to digital, we get all kinds of things, including blockchain. But we can't just jump to blockchain any more than we can just snap our fingers and make a global supply chain all come together and do those things. So here's a couple of digital examples that I think are foundational that get us to blockchain that I think are catalysts. One is digital product passports. The EU has legislation around that, which basically creates this cradle-to-grave history of something, a battery or an item of apparel or something along those lines. We can envision batteries as being created in one place or mined in some place. I'll stick with a car example. I buy the car, I sell it to Irving, Irving sells it to you. Ultimately, that battery is reclaimed or recycled, but there's now going to be a digital history, a cradle-to-grave scenario of that allows you to do that. Once we digitize these things, we get to all kinds of things. We get to digital twins, we get to blockchain, we get to sensors, digital identity, lots and lots of stuff. The other one, again, not a blockchain example, but it's foundational to where we're going here, is U.S. Customs. U.S. Customs, their primary platform is called Automated Commercial Environment, and it's referred to as ACE, A-C-E. Well, they're working on ACE 2.0 right now, and it will be credentialed, which is to say verifiable credentials, digital identity. And so when you're looking on the horizon, and not that far on the horizon, maybe late 26, so not quite 2 years from now, 26, 27 timeframe, the product that's coming into the United States you'll have to have a reputational scenario that connects you to that and says, I'm Dale and I'm telling you this is where it comes from and I'm shipping it to Irving. And at that point, all that is digitized, and then you can start using all the analytics and optimization tools that all the rest of us are using for all the rest of those things. But now they know that I've shipped 5,000 shipments in the last month, and every month Irving orders 10 items, and every month you order 10 items. And now you're starting to digitize those relationships and that reputation from that point of view. And so both of those, I think, are regulatory types of things that are coming. And so whether I want to participate or not, that's up to me. But if I'm going to participate, we talked about this in the last one around the Walmart use case. If you're going to work with Walmart in a leafy green scenario, here are the rules to follow. And regulatory certainly will be a help to moving this, or a catalyst, I think is the word you use, to moving these things forward. And again, we have to get to digital on our way to blockchain.
So that's a really interesting idea. And I'd like to just tease apart one of those major ideas. The idea of a digital identity, I think, has some foundational importance. Being able to know who the counterparty is and that they're not a fraudster, they're not introducing malicious content into the supply chain, they're not trying to steal my money, that they do have this bank account that I can draw against or contribute to, that those sorts of things, that's pretty important. And it's not just individuals, but a company has an identity. And I think you're actually suggesting that individual products or product classes can themselves have identities. And then the second issue that is arguably an attribute of identity, but I think it's almost a distinct thing because it grows and changes in a way that identity doesn't. Identities, to me at least, are pretty static, but reputation and credential is an evolutionary thing, right? That whether I have access to a trustless blockchain, data layer or not, I'm still going to have a predilection, a preference for doing work with and paying a premium to do work with parties that I know have a certain level of quality, that I know can always fill my orders, that I know can deliver on time, consistently. So there are competencies and credentials and reputation that are a big part of that. In fact, once again, that can be on the company level, on the individual level, and even on the product level. So, I agree that another way to solve this problem, either you've got an ecosystem keystone that forces it on everyone that wants to do business in that supply chain, or you have a regulator that comes in and says, listen, everyone's got to have one of these. We already do that, right? We already have banking regulations, and we already have, you have to have licenses to bring things across borders, and there's all kinds of regulation. But that's an interesting approach. Do you think that we're anywhere in the world, a government standing up and saying, listen, for the system to work, we need to have a a truly digital ID and digital credential and digital reputation system?
I do, actually. Dubai is actually a great use case. They actually have a blockchain scenario. I have one of my coworkers joining me on the podcast today, so just wanted to let you know I'm petting my dog because he wants attention. This is Atticus. So we just introduced Atticus to the world. I think increasingly one of the things that I'm very optimistic about in talking with U.S. Customs, Department of Homeland Security, is that they cast a big shadow. That's one of the ways that we at FedEx, we describe ourselves. What shadow do we cast? So we know that U.S. Customs casts a large shadow, really big shadow. And they're also now that influence is cascading over those four walls. And the same discussion around digital identity and verifiable credentials is happening with EU and UK and Australia and others. And so the influence there, we're still talking about that same influence, that same reputation that you just now mentioned, is really broadening this discussion. And it will only take a certain amount of time to get to a tipping point where, you can't snap your fingers and tell all 220 or however many countries, territories there are to actually do it. But certainly the influence, you can reach that critical mass with the largest of the entities, and largest of the entities are having these conversations. So it's actually moving pretty quickly. I mean, when we talk about, most people in the U.S., if you said, okay, where do you think U.S. Customs stands when it relates to digital identity and things like that, they would have no idea that they're that far along. So I take my hat off to them. I compliment them for the vision and for the effort here. And we're really talking about within the next couple of years, we're going to start seeing that in production. And certainly it will start, there's use cases that have already been tested, but we'll see e-commerce, we'll see apparel, things like steel and others from that point of view. So it's actually moving pretty quickly in the kind of glacial, speed of discussions that we're having here. It's actually moving pretty quickly.
Dale, I hadn't heard about ACE. The U.S. government is building ACE, correct?
It is a U.S. Customs platform, but the foundational piece that they're working on for verifiable credentials is actually open source. It's actually W3C. So that speaks to many of the other items that we've already talked about on the previous call and what we'll talk about on this call.
And would the U.S. government make ACE available to the EU and other countries to use? Are they thinking like that?
I think the ultimate way to think of this is the creation of a true global single window. That's how they refer to it, as a single window. So interoperable, right? My system speaks to yours speaks to mine. And again, that open foundational layer through W3C, et cetera, is the way to do that. And then, of course, there will be people that will provide those services, or you can provide them yourself. You can build those connections, those on-ramps and off-ramps yourself. But it will require you to participate in that beyond a certain point if you are shipping product into the United States.
That's a fascinating potential here, especially the fact that it's happening. Other countries can build their own that interoperates with ACE, or I'm assuming since you said it's open source, the U.S. can make ACE available and other countries can add whatever they want to it, and you need some kind of global governance to make sure things work, correct? But I'm assuming customs already has global governance, right?
I would assume the same thing. I don't know the answer to that question, but these are big players that have conversations just like this conversation, right? So somebody's representing EU, somebody's representing US, et cetera, or World Customs or others from that point of view. And at that level, they've worked through many of these things, and they're continuing to broaden that discussion. And again, to me, it's important that we're talking about the digital piece of this. B, it's maybe equally important, maybe even more important, that they're talking about it amongst themselves, right? Beyond just the four walls of the US. And now we're starting to broaden it into common. Yes, we see it the same way. Yes, we've got these open standards that we can use. Yes, I can build on-ramps. Yes, I can build interconnectivity. That, to me, is the value, the scalability piece, Doug, that we talked about a few minutes ago.
I think there's another really interesting component of this, or attribute of this. I have a sense that this sort of technology evolves eventually into what I would think of as digital infrastructure. That much the way that we consume electricity as utility, there's a group of services, including things like digital identity and credentials and carbon tracing and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that, yes, there is the governmental customs issue that says there are goods and services and information moving back and forth across borders, and we need to either secure the border because it's a prohibited good, or it's a regulated good, or it's part of a cold chain, or it's subject to various different taxes and duties. So there's all those kinds of attributes, but there's a second level of attributes. So for example, I've been watching a lot of emerging digital infrastructures around the world. There's some really fascinating cases in China, around the city of Shanghai, and the ultra-scale network that they're building there. There's also one of the most fascinating ones I've been tracking, and we actually work with quite a bit, is LACchain out of Latin America. And what it's enabling is various different groups of alpaca fiber farmers or sugarcane farmers to basically allow them to bind together and to get their goods into things like the European market, because the Europeans have some regulations that say that you can't just farm on places that you've burned down the forest, right? Or we need to be able to track your carbon content, or you can't have any child labor. There's all kinds of regulations. So they need to be able to prove the provenance of all of those goods across the supply chain back to an attestation that has confidence. And so for any given alpaca farmer to build a system like that is ridiculous. They could never, ever do it. But if you have infrastructure that everyone can leverage that system and ties into those custom systems and knows those regulations and can abide by them, then you've got something that can work, and they can, in fact, get their product into those marketplaces.
Yeah, and we have for example, I'm assuming all countries participate in passport regulation. So we say, passport, you can go just about anywhere. And with a passport, people can come here just from anywhere. So there is
with varying degrees of friction, depending on where you're from.
Yeah, but that will always be true. And so what I'm saying is that there are mechanisms for countries to create interoperable platforms to enable them to do business with each other. That's not a new problem. That's something that's been around. And that sounds like something to be leveraged for sure.
Okay, so let's say we've got two of the building blocks. We've got the potential of regulation to accelerate and to standardize and customize. We've got open source, which we mentioned as a means of, first of all, getting the technology adopted inexpensively by lots of people, and implicitly bringing standards to the table, because there's standards embedded inside of open source by the virtue that it's kind of an encoding of standards. Then you've got formal standards themselves, which regulations are a form of, but Dale, you've done a lot of work in that space. But then you've also got, I think, and I'd like to test this with you guys, you've got a number of other technologies intersecting. The obvious ones are IoT and the ability to have digital twins so that you understand where something is and what conditions it's in, because amongst other things, that can radically transform trade finance. And the big one is artificial intelligence. The potential for artificial intelligence to find patterns and make predictions and optimize certain trade patterns and scheduling, and just be able to automate the flow of information and goods at degrees of sophistication and efficiency that we've never seen before. There's an argument to be made that the key reason that blockchain hasn't succeeded is that it's missed these extra components that push it above that that value adoption threshold. And so, I mean, what do you think of the argument that says that add AI to blockchain and suddenly a bunch of magic happens?
As you are talking, as Dale was talking and you're talking now, remember, blockchain was created for financial transactions, including cryptocurrencies and others. But, you know, if the financial institutions around the world wanted to, they could use it for their exchange of monies, transmission of currencies, they could. Now, then people came along and said, gee, we have this blockchain infrastructure, let's use it for supply chains. And as it turns out, it's not working because we're taking an infrastructure that was developed for one purpose and now trying to apply it to an application area that feels very, very different.
But wait, let me push back on you, Irving, on that one a little bit, because moving money around is pretty foundational to any sort of trade.
No, I understand, but clearly moving money has to connect to the supply chains and the trade, but I don't know if it's the basic infrastructure. The ACE platforms and their equivalent around the world that take into account customs and everything else, it may be that one has to step back and take a look at what are the right platforms on which to build the way of having global supply chains, and not immediately say the key objective here is to make sure that blockchain works for global supply chains, because maybe it's missing a lot of the stuff that ACE is doing and that the EU is doing. I'm putting it out there to see if maybe this other way, especially if people are already building it with enough of the right ingredients. And again, I don't know anything about ACE, so I may not know what I'm talking about, but all of a sudden, this could be a more practical approach to a platform, to platforms for global supply chains than building it on.
I was going to say, let me jump in for a second, Doug, if I could, before you loop back to you. So ACE is not a blockchain scenario. U.S. Customs is fine with blockchain. They just don't think it's ready for prime time. I think we probably would all agree with that. But ACE is the primary purpose of ACE, I think, and again, I'm not in this space, is to bring product into the United States, right? It's a platform that allows them to track that, to categorize that, to do all those things from that point of view. And they are now iterating on that to get to the second iteration of ACE, which is now going to include credentialing from that point of view. I'm agnostic to the blockchain solution or whatever the case may be. So I'd have to give that a lot more thought. You may be right. We may need a blockchain light or a blockchain hybrid or a who knows what ultimately within the global supply chain. But as the finance side of things moves forward very quickly, certainly anything that moves in the world has a financial component to it. So certainly those are going to have to be interoperable. And I think it's actually, I think all of us would agree on this, which is if you start with the technology and then you try to fit it into a problem, you're probably not going to like the results, right? So we spent a long time trying to sprinkle blockchain dust on everything and watching to see if it would grow and see if that would solve everything. And I think blockchain is a technology discussion, but I don't think it's only a technology discussion. I think that leads us back to the C-suite. And what problems are we trying to solve? And what are those? And I think ultimately that's what's going to scale a lot of this, whether that's from the C-suite level or whether that's from the regulatory level or whatever the case may be. But it's going to have to come from that side of things. It's not going to have to come from the R&D group on the fourth floor who are saying, let me show you this cool technology.
We agree totally. And remember, when you're in global supply chains, when you're handling payments across the participants, you're not using blockchain, you're using the world's financial infrastructure. So blockchain doesn't help you at all in handling payments because there is a whole world financial infrastructure that's not built on blockchain, and you have to use that because that's been around for decades.
Not yet built on blockchain, and we'll see what happens in the future. Beyond you and me, Irving, we'll see. Certainly they are not efficient systems, right?
No.
There's nothing efficient about those systems. They've been built up over decades.
No, they have, but they work, Dale.
They do work, and you could argue that global commerce also works.
No, and they work, and like the FAA systems, something that works that is so complex that nobody understands it, people are very careful about saying, let me redo it.
It's fascinating, and it frankly goes to a very, very central question, and that is a data fabric question. And I'm taking a risk here going down a rabbit hole, but just for fun, I've been spending a lot of time on AI of late. We're doing a lot of research in AI. And some of the remarks from the CEO of Microsoft in the last little while around agentic AI have given me real pause, and I've tried to do some deep thinking about it, because there's an argument out there that says that what happens is you have all of these AI agents that have resilience to being spoofed because they can understand patterns and they can double check stuff. And the analogy that I've heard is in much the same way that Google changed the nature of search, that information used to be much more hierarchically presented to humans, that you'd navigate through various different folders and subfolders. And Google said, no, just index everything and then just search on stuff and find it. And where it is in the structure and the taxonomy of things isn't nearly as important as being able to find it quickly. And that argument has been a very strong one. But in a similar sort of way, there's this argument that says that you don't need a common data fabric. Everyone can have their own little bits and pieces. You can have these agents that run around and talk to all of them and somehow aggregate all this data situationally. And I get the argument. I understand the analogy, but I fear that I have too much history rooted in technology architecture to dismiss the importance of a data fabric.
No, you need a data fabric. There's no question.
We have individual databases that are reliable by virtue of either you have a government that is regulating it, or you have an entity controlling it that has so much brand equity, if they screwed things up, it would cause them enormous damage. So there's a bunch of models that we depend on to make things happen, and that's the stuff that runs our healthcare records at hospitals and our financial records at banks and our immigration status in governments. But data fabrics that span across multiple jurisdictions, across multiple entities in a supply chain, that is a complex fabric. And that, of course, is the reason that when blockchain emerged, we were so hopeful that it had the attributes of being a data fabric that could be applied to the unique challenges in this space. Do you see any world, even with AI, that basic idea doesn't hold? Dale?
I was hoping Irving was going to answer.
Okay,
that
Irving?
I don't know. I mean, there are multiple levels of data fabric. There is, for example, Hyperledger, which is I mean, in blockchain, there are multiple data fabrics, correct?
Sure.
I believe Hyperledger is one of them. So I don't know. I mean, we've raised a number of questions here. It's almost as if you almost would want to charter a study to see if you wanted to build an open, digital, standards-based platform to support global supply chains, what would you do? And use existing things as much as possible to do the right things here. Don't reinvent the wheel if there are things that exist or are getting built that could be used for this. And I just don't know enough to know what to say, but that would be a very good thing to do. And sort of the appeal of, let's say, the application Dale mentioned for bringing customs in the US feels very close to what supply chains need to do.
Well, it would certainly be broader than just the customs piece, right? It would be, I mean, that's the customs is just one, you know, if you're thinking of a Venn diagram, that's one of the circles would be customs, right? Financial would be a piece of it. Movement would be a piece, right?
Tracking and tracing. There's provenance issues. There's a ton of ancillary attributes of these kinds of things.
And I don't disagree with the comment that Irving made about the financial system in the world is incredibly complex, and not many people would want to take that on and change it. But I'm one of those people. I'm one of those, my brain connects dots. And when I see the opportunity to improve something or to change something, I lock in on that. And that's probably what led me to this space a number of years ago from that point of view. And so I certainly agree with you. And I won't share any specifics with you, but I've reached out to multiple entities within governments and others and said, we think there's a better way to consider doing this. And sometimes the answer is it works good enough. Why would we mess with it? Which is kind of what we said about the financial system, right? And yet you can say the same thing about the global supply chains, right? You can say, look, it's been working forever and ever, but it's also, you know, and we speak to this in the Global Blockchain Business Council article that we published, Global Standards Mapping Initiative in December about the future of global supply chains. It is, you know, this has been happening for centuries, more than centuries. I mean, the bill of lading that is used today is probably 300 or 400 years old, literally unchanged. And yet what we have now, you could argue, has been essentially a network effect. The flywheel has continued to turn. The network effect is out there now, and the momentum is there. And whether you get back to the metric system or the industrial age or railroads and train, I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of that are spinning here. And now yet here we are at the moment with the rear view mirror being paper-driven processes and this proxy of trust that we've used for millennia. And the windshield is everything digital. Yeah, it's not just a blockchain discussion. It's everything digital. And we are literally at that moment in human history right this second.
But Dale, here, financial industry may very well be the most digital industry in the world. And if it's not
I can't disagree with that.
It's one of the most. Global supply chain may well be one of the least digital industries in the world, with bill of ladings and other stuff as examples. And before we start applying AI and other advanced technologies to make global supply chains better, the goddamn components have to be digitized.
But AI is part of that, right? We talked about 4 billion documents every single day that are produced in global supply chains. If we can apply increasingly sophisticated AI that understands intent and context, and we can radically transform document processing efficiency and, its capabilities, and then integrate those onto AI-driven agentic workflows and, really dramatically improve automation. My question is, if you combine those capabilities with the data fabric of a trusted database, a trusted state engine, do you think we might get to that value threshold above which everyone says the value is so compelling and so obvious that we suddenly rush towards mass adoption?
No, I understand. I mean, you're raising a superb question, and I feel the need to reach out to people who know a hell of a lot more than me, like, let's say, Jerry.
I already said you guys are the two smartest guys I know on this.
No, but there are people who know a lot. I'm not saying about Dale, but for example, I was just talking to Jerry Cuomo. You know who he is?
He's been a past guest on the podcast. I know Jerry very well.
Dale, do you know who he is?
I do.
And I was talking to him yesterday about agentic AI and things like that. And it may be that one of the things we need is a group of people to discuss things and including from companies very involved in supply chains to look at these things. The reason I feel we need that is I don't want to say things that are so naive in a podcast that people will say, who the hell is Irving guy? Why are you talking to him if he's 80 years old? You don't realize.
Let me grab exactly what you're saying is that there ought to be experts that are worrying about this. And there are organizations.
Or that we can ask to help.
Right. So let me pivot this to Dale, because Dale, you're kind of in the middle of this, but we do have organizations like the World's Customs Organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the United Nations Center for Trade, Facilitation, Electronic Business. So we have various different organizations and a bunch of standards organizations, and you yourself are involved with the BITA Standards Council, and you've been publishing frameworks around thinking through what you referred to in the first part of this podcast as the International Space Station view of things. What should we know about what's really going on in terms of very smart people working on this problem? How much progress are we making, and what's the trajectory of a lot of these efforts?
Well, I'm glad you asked, and we're ready to announce it right here in this podcast that we solved the whole thing.
Oh,
no,
good.
Obviously not.
Well, thank you for your time. And
there's a couple of components to that question. On the standards side of things, the focus that we put into the paper was from the International Space Station view, and there are about a dozen and a half or so international standards entities that exist today. They range from the 1990s to the 1860s. So not much has changed since then in technology or in anything that we can think of. So you can only imagine that they are very different in how they handle things, right? But when you pull back up to that International Space Station view and you say these are the 18, they are all essentially very focused. I say micro. I think we used the word narrow earlier in the discussion. They are narrowed essentially to an industry. So you've got world customs that's focused on customs. You've got maritime. You've got air. You've got some of those types of things. And yet, when again, if we created a Venn diagram, there's a little bit of overlap there, but it also doesn't. None of them were designed at the International Space Station level. So if that's my default position, which it is my default position, that's my true north is, come up here with me. Let me show you what this has got to look like moving forward. We finished that document with a call to action to those 18 or so standards entities and interested stakeholders to create such a dialogue, to say, what you have done is fantastic. You've been doing it in some cases for decades or maybe more than a century, and it has led us to this point, and it's fantastic, period. That being said, let me take you up to this International Space Station and show you where we think this is going. How can we put our heads together and work on that? So that certainly is an opportunity to do that. The second of the two pieces, we came out in maybe early 2019, basically, and said, look, we think this has got to take, on the blockchain side of things, we think it's going to take an open foundation, like an open commerce foundation, maybe a Linux type of a thing or something, with a small number of key entities. Certainly my word co-opetition is in the middle of that, pro-competitive co-opetition, which is to say that FedEx is a founding member of the Bit of Standards Council, as is UPS, and there are other examples of that. So I'm doing what I'm challenging other people to do, which is I sit side by side with UPS and others to work through some of those things. We really felt it was going to take kind of a small number, not 500, not 2, to create essentially an open foundational layer that would allow us to get to that point. And it would have to be open. It would have to be work for the largest and the smallest of entities, down to the lone entrepreneur. And we still think that's an opportunity from that point of view. We still think it's going to take something like that. Certainly, if you wait for any one company to do it, you're going to be waiting a really long time. It just simply won't work. And so that's why part of this is technology-based, and certainly the technology has matured, but part of it is more cultural. Part of it is more, hey, Doug, let's work. Hey, Irving, hey, let's work together. Let's. And one final piece, I won't go deeper than this, but my co-opetition reference is, my definition of that is, it's not about where we compete. It's about where we can agree.
No, of course.
So it's not actually a blockchain reference at all. We saw co-opetition during the pandemic, where we could be arguing across the back fence about our favorite sports team. And then during the pandemic, we all dropped everything and we were trying to get PPE and ventilators to people around the world that we'd never meet. That's co-opetition. That's where can we agree? We can agree there. So we have to keep driving this where can we agree piece of this. And those are two of the examples. One is at the standards level, where we think there's an opportunity to gather those entities and to find common areas where, yes, what you've done is fantastic, and you, and yet let's go up here and see what's the next generation of this, and how can we streamline, how can we reduce friction across borders through these standards, through these open standards, interoperability, harmonization, that kind of thing as well. And then on the more specific use cases, we think it's going to take a small number of key players, and that maybe that's where the Jerrys of the world come in, or others, to be able to say, let's get some small group of people here. Under what set of circumstances might that scale? And I think you have to start with that in mind, because you're answering that open-ended question, right? You're trying to solve for something at that point. Okay, well, we could do this, and I could do this, and you could do this, and we could do this. But we have to take that approach, I think, in both of those cases.
There could organizations like the World Economic Forum play a convening role?
Sure, absolutely. And it's going to take a number, right? It's going to take WEF. It might take World Customs. It might take Microsoft. It might take, who knows, right? I mean, there would be a number of entities. It can't just come from the standards world, because the standards don't move product. That's the foundational piece for BITA, is it's all around movement. It's movement. And so, but it's going to have to come from a lot of industry, right? It's going to have to come from enterprise. It's going to have to come potentially from regulatory or from standards.
You need a convener of all these things, and that's what I was trying to put my head around. Who could be a convener? The WEF is a potential one.
Be an example. Yep, that's fine.
They do good work. They've done very good work on digital identities in the past, and I think they're very trusted.
So, maybe this analogy doesn't hold, but I'm going to try it anyway. It seems to me that what we're really saying is, at least I think there's kind of two elements that add to one of these magical moments where something kind of really spontaneously happens or starts to happen at an accelerated rate. If you think about, growing a big complex crystal, there's kind of two things you need, right? You need a supersaturated liquid, basically the constituent building blocks, the things to support it. And then you need a seed crystal, right? That something tangible has been introduced. And once it's introduced, all of those other conditional things all get assembled. And suddenly the pattern for how to assemble all those constituent pieces to build something magnificent is presented. And then the system just starts building like crazy and you develop these incredibly sophisticated crystals. I don't know if the analogy holds, but I have a sense, and I think this is where you were going, Irving, it's something like, if it's not ACE, something else out there, maybe it's one of these digital infrastructure initiatives. Someone's going to assemble various different bits and pieces, prove that it works, and everyone's going to kind of swivel their heads and say, oh, that's interesting. And some people are going to kind of figure out what we can attach to it, and other people are going to figure out how we can emulate it, and some other people are going to figure out how we can apply it in our jurisdiction. And then you start to see acceleration. I mean, that's been a common pattern throughout history. So, I mean, do you see that mechanism? We've talked about a bunch of the core building blocks: regulations, standards, open source, the data fabric, blockchain technologies, accelerators like AI and IoT. There's all those constituent parts. We're talking about groups of people and organizations that are trying to catalyze those parts and create something out of them. And we've got these experiments running around the world. Is some combination of those elements likely in the next, 5 years to coalesce into something that we'll all suddenly recognize as now we're on the right path?
I'm going to go with yes. I'm the optimist here. I'm the idealist.
You think
here.
in 5 years we'll have that moment where?
I mean, I wrote that section of that paper with a focus on the global supply chain of 2035 and beyond. Mm-hmm. And I know we talked about maybe adding a question there, but I put that time frame out, and that's 10 years out. What we've seen with AI and agentic AI has happened so quickly, so quickly, that if you start thinking of the trajectory, if you start thinking of what that looks like, I think on the front end of that, 5 years is yes. I think 10 years is a definite.
So can you include Dale's paper when you post the podcast?
Yeah, I can put it in the show notes. Yeah, I'll put some of your blog posts in there as well.
Yeah, but Dale, I don't know if you've sent me the paper, but if you haven't, I would really appreciate it.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
And by the way, Doug, let me come back to a previous point here, which I think is important, both internally for me and also externally for this conversation, is that businesses are in business to be in business, right? They want a profit layer, they want ROI, they want to do those things, and that's important, and that's necessary, and that's okay. But a big piece of what we've been talking about is actually a second layer. So I think anytime we start thinking about this, there's actually kind of a fork in the road, if you will. There's a public layer and a private layer, or a proprietary layer. And it's okay to think of both, but you can't only think of just one or the other. It has to be both. Certainly people spent years trying to think of the proprietary thing, which is we've got really bright people. So I've got Irving and Doug and Dale, and we all signed non-disclosures, and we're going to build something and get rich quick, right? We've seen that hasn't worked, and it didn't work. So, but certainly, any of these entities we're talking about are going to want to have some return on their investment from that point of view, but we can't skip that step. There is this public layer, that pro-competitive co-opetition layer, that says we have to do something that's bigger than us. And we said that. Our CIO said that in early 2019. For blockchain to scale, it has to be bigger than us, quote unquote. And that's the conversation I want to get into with World Economic Forum, with UPS, or with Microsoft, or with others, which is, this is bigger than us. There's a commons thing here. There's a for the good of all that we need to put our heads together to make this thing work. And it's going to take some piece of that. And once that's built, or as it's being built, then have a separate room full of people that are working on proprietary stuff, right? It's like building out the interstate highway system. We split the group into two, and one side is working on how do you actually build it, right? And the other group is how could you monetize it, right? Oh, we could put fast food, we could put this, we could put this. But But it's not the same group and it's not the same discussion. It's an and, it's not an or.
Yeah. Well, I would say one of the gigantic successes of the internet was that the open fabric, TCP/IP, and the web standards and the email standards were relatively simple at this level, and everything else was a proprietary application built on top of it. And there, Amazon can do whatever the hell they want to, and Google can do whatever the hell they want to, and they all leverage the infrastructure layer. And there were some mistakes, like people have said, God, we should have put security in the infrastructure layer. They didn't, and the reason they didn't is because that would have complicated the infrastructure layer. So they pushed it up. It's become a bit of a problem, but it's better to have this. And what we're talking about feels like that you need a common thing, and then all these various applications and so on are on top of it, and they need to interoperate with each other, clearly.
Okay,
exactly.
So just to kind of recap, where we are so far, we've talked about the maturity of the underlying technology and its role as being a data fabric that facilitates a number of different use cases in the supply chain space. We've talked about the role of regulations and open source and standards. We've talked about some of the complementary technologies that may magnify the value of this technology and collectively get us closer to that value threshold point after which adoption is accelerated. We've talked about the idea of seed crystals and incubating mediums and those sorts of things. So if, because you're this pathological optimist, we get to that magic point sometime, hopefully in the next 5 years, or at least we get to the point where we can recognize that it's starting to happen, what kind of business models do you think emerge out of that? I have a sense, and correct me if I'm just completely wrong on this, but the supply chains, especially very big supply chains and especially international supply chains, there are barriers to entry because of longstanding relationships, because of regulatory compliance issues, because of just complexity of dealing with the underlying technologies and the regulations. Could it be that if this technology gets structured in a infrastructure level incarnation, that we reduce the barriers to entry, and that many, many more of these businesses that you're referring to that are in business to do business suddenly have access to a new kind of infrastructure that allows them to assemble into completely new kinds of configurations and then deassemble and reassemble into new configurations with flexibility and agility that they've never had before? Do you think that this is just fanciful, or is this possible?
Well, this is the shortest answer you're ever going to get from me. Yes. That's my short answer to that. And now let me build it foundationally as to how I got to yes, which is 2035 and beyond. Again, this is one person's maybe educated guess. We'll see, and research that we've done and all that stuff. Global supply chains will be harmonized, interoperable, open, because the opposite of open is a big toll road, right? It's a series of toll roads that favors the big companies over the small companies, because the big ones don't care and they'll pass it along, and the small ones can't afford to do it. So it's got to be open. It'll be highly integrated. It's going to be intelligent. It's going to be adaptive. Smart contracts, AI agent smart contracts will automate transactions. Sensors is a whole nother layer on top of this. It's not, don't jam it together. These are all separate, like swim lanes, if you will. Sensors will be increasingly ubiquitous. And once we know where everything is, because of the sensor, it gives you a pulse, right? So at that point, you are then you can you can memorialize that pulse if you want onto a blockchain or something, and then you can create digital twins out of it, whatever the case may be. But once you know where everything is, we won't need as much. That starts affecting inventory levels, working capital, that connects all kinds of things from that point of view. But when I know where everything is, it also changes my distribution centers and where those are located and what that looks like. And the point that you made a moment ago, which is that, yes, once those systems exist, once I can access U.S. customs entry into the United States through a system like that, where I am a lone entrepreneur, and I can now access that, and now I can connect to FedEx, UPS, DHL, or others in Sierra Leone, or pick any example you want to pick, you've now included me in the global economy, right? And by that point, I will have a banking option that would be digital, whether it looks like this or not, but it won't be a physical bank. But we're now opening up the world to a couple of billion people. You know, Don Tapscott and Alex wrote about that in Blockchain Revolution early on, about the unbanked. And so when you connect all those dots, and you can now move a product from Dale into the United States or Canada to one of the two of you, and the clearance moves at the speed of data and is no longer limited to the speed of physical movement like we saw in the pandemic, where everything came to a screeching halt. That speeds up that process. It reduces friction. You've now got a very different global economy. You've got a global supply chain that is now quick, it's agile, it's adaptive, it's data-driven. All the analytics and optimization tools that will allow you to take your digital twins and all the rest of that stuff and feed it back into your AI systems and all the rest of that. It's a very different global supply chain, and that's what's in our windshield. What's in our rearview mirror is billions of documents a day.
Let me add to Dale's optimism that I actually think we have no choice but to do this, because if we agree with Adam Smith that our economic relations with each other build trust, and that trust is necessary to have the economic relations, a world in which we don't have global supply chains means something is really wrong, or where the global supply chains are not functioning well. So we almost don't have a choice if we want a positive future world, but to have global supply chains that work well, because they are at the heart of the global economy. Now you could say, well, Irving, you're being too idealistic. Well, you know, I believe in free markets. I believe in free trade. I don't think those thoughts go way back a few hundred years. So, no, I think this, we don't have a choice, is what I'm saying to what Dale.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't have a choice. It's absolutely an imperative, and it's possible.
It's possible because of advances in technology and so on.
So
But what are we waiting for, right?
Yeah. Well. So we kind of actually jumped to my last question, but there was one question I wanted to ask just before that last question. So it's a little out of order, but maybe it slots in here. Are there any lessons that this industry, which we've pointed out has been a slow adopter of digitization, and that has so much so much potential, and that there's so much need for, are there any lessons that we should be taking from other industries about how to implement the technology, how to deal with these multi-party alignment problems, or are the challenges in supply chain just completely unique?
Well, let me give a very simplistic, maybe overly simplistic answer. If I look at a spectrum with large industries, there is no question the financial industry has done a magnificent job. I'm not saying checks are clearing this. Actually, we're moving away from checks, but it works remarkably well. At the other end is the healthcare sector, where there is huge waste. In the US, it consumes 18-20% of GDP. Things don't interoperate with each other. People in the healthcare sector are saying, maybe the answer is AI. But of course, before you get to AI, the fact that electronic health records are trapped in proprietary platforms in separate hospitals says, if your electronic health records don't interoperate across hospitals, we have a problem. That doesn't work. So healthcare is here. Now, one reason healthcare is here is because by the nature of healthcare, it's very difficult to do experimentation because you don't want to kill people. And so it's highly regulated. There are few startups because of this issue of, you're dealing with people's health.
There are parts of that industry, right? Like in the pharmaceutical part that's making very aggressive adoption of both blockchain and AI and doing so very successfully.
Research part,
yes, that's right.
There is the research part, not just pharmaceuticals, but medical devices.
Yep.
All that works really well. Then there are two other parts. Healthcare delivery is where you get into electronic health records and so on. And then you have the payments part, the insurance and the government, and that also doesn't work so well. So
it's adversarial, unfortunately, but yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I think, there is no reason that global supply chain couldn't work, and there is no reason.
Yeah. Do you think there's any lessons to be learned from other industries?
Well, first of all, I think the global supply chain piece is inevitable. That's the word I'll use. It's inevitable. I think all these are inevitable, by the way. It's just a question of what's the trajectory on healthcare versus what's the trajectory on finance versus other examples as well.
Sorry, let me just test or push back, I happen to agree with you, but let me just play devil's advocate for a second. But even in light of the political dynamic around, increasing regionalism or nationalism and deglobalization, you think that ultimately at the end of the day, global supply chains win out?
My optimistic view is the world goes through, waves.
Cycles, yeah.
We are in a certain wave, but we cannot stay in that wave. So things will...
Dale, what do you think?
I'm sticking with the word inevitable. And again, it's only a question of how long it's going to take. It's not whether it's going to happen or not. It's only a question of how long it's going to take. There's too much. We will reach a tipping point, right? There's lots of things that are already digitized at this point, and the more we talk about it, the more we get it out there, the more we share knowledge, the more we get this broader view, this space view of, wait a second, gosh, you're right. Pick out FedEx on the map or UPS. You can't pick anything, right? It's going to have to come together for this to work. And so am I right about 10 years or beyond? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that's optimistic from that point of view. I don't know. But I believe it's inevitable. It's not a question of whether, this will never happen. Yes, it will. Because, again, you're seeing U.S. Customs digitize all the identity piece of this. I mean, digital identity is one of those holy grail kinds of things. I mean, and at that point, once you've got it digitized, It's more of a ratchet at that point. It's more of a take a step, take a step. You're not going to have any steps backward. You're not going to go, U.S. Customs tried that for a while, but they backed out of that. But no. It's only going to say, well, if you're doing that and if EU is doing digital product passports, and now you know where that product came from all the way back to it was not a forced labor scenario, all that's digital. You've got agentic AI. You've got all this is digital. It's all moving in that direction. The only question becomes the speed with which it moves. Mm-hmm. And I don't have that answer. Nobody has that answer, but I'm going to be on the front end of that, challenging everyone to look holistically at this from that view to say, we can do this. This is coming. Let's work together to make that happen.
So just to bring the thing full circle, it sounds like what you're saying is that Irving's initial enthusiasm and predictions about how global supply chain is going to be transformed by this technology is right. He was just overly optimistic about the timing.
Exactly.
I think he's right. He has been right. He's still right. And he's still going to be right. He's correct. That's what's going to happen. We don't have a time frame. But again, if you think of what we're talking about here, we're talking about, 2008. It's not even 20 years yet. Look at other technologies. Look where things have happened in less than 20 years. And once in a while, you get the iPhone, right? Once in a while, you get something that is like, wait a second, that just changed everything. It's inevitable. There's no steps backward in this. There's literally nobody that's going to say, by the way, I know we've used paper and I tried digital, but I just don't like it. We're just going to go back. That is not going to go backwards. It might inch forward and it might leap forward and it might be some combination of those things. But Irving is correct and he was correct.
Yeah, I have to say, as you were talking, something that came to mind is that in the late 90s, I was involved, and in fact, I was co-chair for a while of the President's IT Advisory Committee. This is a committee to advise at the time President Clinton. And one of the things we were very worried was digital divide of the internet technologies. This is, let's say, 1998. Because, if only a small segment of the population could have access to the internet because you needed a PC or you needed a laptop, something, that would be a huge problem. Then, guess what happened? 10 years later, we got mobile devices. All of a sudden, the entry price to access the internet around the world started crashing. And then you got wireless technology and on and on and on and on. And now it's pretty universal. It took, 20 years, but the normal forces of the economy, and I think a lot of the technologies we're talking about are truly global and part of global supply chain. I mean, look at iPhones and Samsung phones and all the other phones,
Apple tags and all kinds of things along those lines. Yeah.
All these things. And, once the world started going, something that we had no idea how to solved itself with the forces of free markets and business. And this feels like that.
So what I'm taking away from this is that there's this inevitability for all of those things about the advance of technology, the market forces, all these things point to a direction that says this is going to happen. I also have a sense, and I'm parsing through a few of your words here, that there's a sense of necessity, that we are living in a period of history that we have to find ways of doing a lot more with finite resources. We have to be tremendously more productive than we've ever been before, or else very bad things happen. So I'm hoping, and I think you'll all join me, that these two forces will intersect and that what is inevitable will come into reality within a time frame that allows the worst effects that related to the necessity from taking full effect. And so that's That's my hope. And I hope that, I suppose the very last thing I'll ask is for any of our listeners out there that either want to learn more about this or figure out how to contribute to the dialogue at this intersection of inevitability and necessity, what should they do? Should they just read more? Should they get involved in these standards organizations or these UN organizations? How can they help? How can they contribute their ideas and their energies?
Well, it's a great question, and there's no single answer to that. Obviously, from my point of view, I've been involved. We were founding members of BITA Standards Council. We came together in 2017, around the same time that BRI was formed. We were members of BRI as well. And certainly this kind of conversation is incredibly helpful. And I've been, so humbled to have networking available to, world customs or U.S. customs or others from that point of view. But it's the dialogue. It's like get involved and push for that on an internal basis. Again, I think one of the unique concepts we talked about today is actually this public and proprietary, and to be able to have both of those conversations at the same time. Most people I run into don't have any sense at all that there's a public layer that they should even have any involvement in, let alone think about it or use it as a strategy. And so I think those are important things as well. From a business point of view, what is your company doing from that point of view? Are you involved with that? Are you reaching out? Are you involved with standards entities? Are you involved with entities like BITA or BRI or others where the dialogue is helping to drive this conversation toward the inevitability of it?
Or form a working group inside your company and be a leader and get the conversation going.
You can't just stay within your own four walls and be a global citizen in this conversation. You just can't.
Okay. This has been absolutely great. And of course, we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, and I'm sure that this space will be evolving in interesting and exciting ways. Thank you both so much, both Irving and Dale, for joining us today and sharing your insight. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information about FedEx at fedex.com, and you can find out information about the Global Blockchain Business Council's report on the future of global supply chains that Dale helped author at gbbc.io. And you can also read Irving's blog at blog.irvingwb.com. I'll put the links to all of that information in the show notes. You can find out more information about this and many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And while you're there, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope that you've enjoyed both of these episodes of W3B Talks and that you will join us for our next episode. Thank you so much, Irving and Dale. Have a great day. Bye-bye.